Get ready for a deep dive today into a case that shook Singapore back in 2013, the Kovan murders. And we're not just going to, rehash what happened, but really get into the why it happened, the how it happened, the layers of betrayal, the shocking violence coming from, honestly, seemingly ordinary lives.
Yeah, it really is a case, I think, that, reminds us that appearances can be deceiving. Even in a place like Singapore, known for its order and safety, darkness can really lurk beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And we're going to unpack all of that today. We're talking court testimony, forensic evidence, even the convicted killer's own words. Expert speaker, you've been deep in this case. What makes it so compelling even now, years later?
Well, the case really reads like a psychological thriller. I mean, you have these seemingly unconnected lives that just collide in the most tragic way imaginable. And so we'll look at how financial desperation, this web of deceit, and ultimately this brutal violence all converge on this, what seems like an ordinary day in July of 2013.
Okay, so let's set the scene. July 10th, 2013, a Wednesday, just a typical day, right? In the quiet residential area of Kovan, Singapore. Picture commuters going about their day at the Kovan MRT station when suddenly
a silver Toyota Camry just speeds past, dragging the body of a man beneath it. Imagine being one of those commuters, just the shock, the horror of witnessing something so unexpected and just deeply disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like something straight out of a nightmare, except this was very real. And this wasn't just a random hit and run. This horrifying scene was actually the climax of a crime spree that began just a kilometer away at a house on Hillside Drive. And we actually have eyewitness accounts from that day, right?
We do. One eyewitness, a woman named Salama, a domestic helper who was working in the neighborhood. She was actually one of the last people to see the younger victim, Tan Chi Hong, alive.
So what does she see?
So Salama, she describes seeing Tan Chi Hang stumbling out of the house, clutching his bleeding neck and collapsing in the driveway. And she says that just moments later, another man ran out of the house, jumped into a silver Toyota Camry, and then deliberately drove over Tan Chi Hang's body as he lay injured in the driveway.
Oh my gosh, that's chilling. I can't even imagine witnessing something so brutal. It seems unreal, like you said, something out of a movie, not something that happens on a quiet residential street.
Absolutely. And, and the violence of this really left an indelible mark on those who witnessed it. Another eyewitness, a caretaker at a nearby school named Anthony Fabian, he also saw the silver Camry speeding away from the scene. And he would later say that the image of that car driving over the victim's body just stayed with him long after that day.
It's just hard to comprehend that level of violence. And, obviously we have these eyewitness accounts that paint this horrifying picture. But I think we need to step back for a second and talk about the victims in this case. Who were they? And what could possibly have led to such a brutal attack?
So the victims were 67-year-old Tan Boon Sin and his 42-year-old son, Tan Chi Hyong. Tan Boon Sin was a well-respected figure in the community, known for his car workshop business.
So not just a random target. This is someone who, it sounds like, was known in the area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And people described him as a kind, hardworking man, a devoted husband and father. He was known for his generosity, even helping out his employees who were in need.
What about his son, Tan Chi Hyong?
So Tan Chi Hyong was a successful businessman in his own right. He had a loving wife and 2 young sons who were, only 10 and 3 years old at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine the impact of his loss, especially on those boys? Their drawings were actually placed in his coffin later. Just a really heartbreaking testament to the depth of their love and the magnitude of their loss.
It's just heartbreaking to think about, especially knowing that they were targeted, that this wasn't some, like we said, random act of violence. And it makes you wonder, what kind of person could commit such a horrific act, taking the lives of a father and a son with such just brutality?
Well, and that's where this case takes a really, really unexpected turn. Because the perpetrator, he wasn't some unknown assailant or anything. It was Iskandar bin Rahmat, a decorated senior staff sergeant in the Singapore police force.
Wait, a police officer? You're kidding?
No kidding. And not just any officer, but one who was described by his colleagues as efficient, knowledgeable, someone who'd earned commendations for his work. There's even accounts of him receiving praise from a resident for the way he handled a noise complaint. So on the surface, seemed like a good officer, dedicated to his duty.
It's even more unsettling, right? This contrast between this public persona and then the brutality of his actions. It's jarring.
Right.
And it's just a stark reminder that you never really know what goes on behind closed doors,
Right.
like the hidden struggles that someone might be facing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in Iskandar's case, behind that facade of this decorated officer was a man who was grappling with some serious financial problems.
So we've got this decorated police officer, well-respected in the community, but like you said, crippled by this financial debt. How does that lead to him brutally murdering a father and a son?
It's almost like, a powder keg, right? You have this immense pressure building, and in Iskandar's case, it seems that pressure led him down a very, very dark path.
Yeah, and that path led him to the Tan's doorstep. But to really understand the motive, it sounds like we need to go back a little bit further.
Yeah, about a year before the murders, Tan Boon Sin actually reported a theft from his safe deposit box, and guess who was assigned to investigate?
No way, Sucumber.
Yep, he was the initial investigating officer on the case. Now, the case was later reassigned, but Iskandar would have had access to all the details, Tan Boon Sin's address, the fact that he kept valuables in a safe deposit box, everything.
So Iskandar had insider information, essentially, information he could exploit when he was, well, desperate for money.
That's exactly what the prosecution argued. Remember those disciplinary hearings he was facing? Because of his hidden debts. I mean, he was at risk of losing his job, his reputation, everything.
Okay, yeah, it's all starting to add up now, the pressure, knowing about Tan Boon Sin and his valuables. But does that mean that he went there intending to kill?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? To really understand that, we have to look at the murder weapon, or rather the lack thereof.
Okay, now you've got me. What do you mean?
So the murder weapon, a knife, was never recovered. Iskandar claimed that he didn't bring a weapon with him that day. He said that he went there intending to rob Tan Boon Sin, but that the older man actually attacked him first with a kitchen knife.
Hold on. So he just expected Tan Boon Sin to hand over his valuables just like that. As a police officer, wouldn't he know that's not how things work in the real world?
Yeah, it does seem naive, doesn't it? But Iskandar was adamant about this. He even gave a very detailed description of this alleged murder weapon, claiming that it was a grooved kitchen knife, slightly shorter than the width of an A4 piece of paper.
And what did investigators find at the Tan household?
So this is where it gets interesting. The police, they searched the house top to bottom, and they found no knives that matched Iskandar's description. The knives belonging to the Tans were either flat-bladed or too small. And this little detail, this discrepancy, became a key point of contention during the trial.
Yeah, I can see why the prosecution must have jumped all over that.
Oh, they did. The prosecution argued that this missing knife, it pointed to premeditation. They believed that Iskandar brought the murder weapon with him, suggesting that this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, but a planned attack.
So if he planned to kill Tan Boon Sin, what about Tan Chi-hyung? Was he a target too?
According to Iskandar, no. The younger Tan was not part of the plan. He claimed that just moments after he killed Tan Boon Sin, Tan Chi-hyung arrived home, walking in on this horrific scene.
Oh my God, I can't even imagine walking in on something like that. Your own father?
It must have been absolutely terrifying for him. Iskandar claimed that Tan Chi-hyung, understandably, rushed at him and a struggle ensued. And it was during this struggle, he claimed, that he stabbed Tan Chi-hyung, again in self-defense. And then he panicked, fled the house in Tan Boon Sin's Camry, and that's when he ended up dragging Tan Chi-hyung's body under the car.
Wow, so he's claiming he killed both men in self-defense. Did anyone buy that story?
Well, to understand how that defense played out, you have to look at the forensic evidence. And that painted a very, very different picture.
Okay, this is where it gets really technical. Let's dive into that forensic evidence because something tells me it's key to understanding the judge's verdict.
You're absolutely right. The forensic analysis, it became a crucial turning point in this case, especially when you consider the sheer brutality of the attacks.
Okay, let's unpack this forensic evidence.
Mm-hmm.
What did the experts find?
Well, the details are pretty gruesome, but they really do reveal a lot about the nature of this attack. The forensic pathologist who examined both victims, Dr. Gilbert Lau, he testified that Tan Boon Sin had sustained 27 stab wounds and incised wounds, mostly concentrated around his head, neck, and chest.
27 wounds, that's not just violence. That feels personal, almost rage-filled.
That's what's so striking about it, the sheer number of wounds. It suggests something more than just a struggle. And remember, Tan Boon Sin was an older man. He had a knee condition. The prosecution really honed in on this. They argued it would have been virtually impossible for him to have launched this prolonged attack on a younger, fitter man like Iskandar.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it just seems far-fetched that he could inflict those kinds of injuries on Iskandar in self-defense. What about Tan Chi-hyung? Were his injuries similar?
Tragically, yes. He had 20 stab and incised wounds, also concentrated around his head, neck, and chest. In fact, the prosecution actually asked Dr. Lau directly if the number and location of the wounds on both victims were consistent with self-defense.
And what did he say?
He said that, while he couldn't definitively rule out self-defense, it would have been an extremely excessive form of self-defense, especially given the victim's positions and the lack of defensive wounds on Iskandar himself.
Wait, so Iskandar is claiming that he was fighting for his life against both of these men, yet he had almost no injuries to support that claim.
Exactly. He had a superficial bite mark and a cut on his hand, but nothing that suggested the kind of life-or-death struggle that he was describing. And this discrepancy between his testimony and the physical evidence, it was a major blow to his defense.
Yeah, it seems like the forensic evidence is really poking some serious holes in Iskandar's story. Was there anything else that really stood out to you?
Yeah, there's another crucial detail. Remember how Iskandar claimed he only attacked Tan Chi-hong after the younger man rushed at him? Well, the prosecution pointed out that Iskandar was significantly larger and heavier than Tan Chi-hong. They argued that, even if there was a struggle, Iskandar had a clear physical advantage.
So they're saying he could have easily subdued Tan Chi-hong without resorting to, such extreme violence.
Exactly. They argued that the sheer brutality of the attack, especially on Tan Chi-hong, it was just completely unnecessary if Iskandar was genuinely just trying to defend himself. They painted this picture of a man who had completely lost control, driven by panic and this desperate need to escape the consequences of his actions.
And what about the fact that he fled to Malaysia immediately after the murders? Didn't he, cross the border on a scooter or something?
He did, yeah. Just hours after the killings, he crossed over. He even contacted his supervisor, pretending to be surprised about his alleged involvement in the case.
Wow, so he really thought he could just, slip away to another country and pretend that none of this ever happened? I mean, that doesn't sound like someone who's acting purely in self-defense. It sounds like someone who's trying to avoid responsibility for their actions.
And the prosecution used that. They argued that his flight to Malaysia showed a clear consciousness of guilt. And they also presented evidence that he had withdrawn a large sum of money before fleeing, suggesting that he was preparing for life on the run.
So the evidence is really stacking up against Iskandar at this point. But what about his defense team? How did they try to counter all of this?
So his lawyers, they were in a tough spot, but they did their best to present a different narrative. They really focused on portraying Iskandar as this desperate man who made a series of terrible decisions under immense pressure.
So they're acknowledging his financial troubles, the pressure that he was under.
Absolutely. They argued that his initial intention was simply to rob Tan Boon Sin, to get the money that he so desperately needed to avoid this financial ruin and potentially save his job, They pointed to what they called his clumsy disguise. Remember, he used the name Raman and pretended to be an intelligence officer. They said, look, this is not a sophisticated hitman. This is an amateur.
It does sound more like a desperate, kind of poorly thought out plan than some sort of calculated murder plot.
That's exactly what they wanted the jury to believe. They basically conceded that he was guilty of a crime, robbery perhaps. But they argued for a lesser charge of culpable homicide not amounting to murder, which carries, of course, a less severe penalty than the mandatory death sentence for intentional murder.
So they're basically saying, yes, he did it, but it wasn't cold-blooded murder.
Essentially, yeah, that was their argument. They said, look, he never intended to kill either man. These deaths were an unintended consequence of his actions, fueled by panic and desperation. But, given the overwhelming forensic evidence and the inconsistencies in his story, it was a very, very uphill battle.
Yeah, for sure. So we've covered a lot of ground here. The victims, the perpetrator, this mysterious murder weapon that was never found, the forensic evidence, the arguments from both sides. But the big question, of course, is what was the verdict?
Well, after a 9-day trial that gripped the nation, the judge delivered his verdict. Guilty of murder.
Wow, guilty of murder on both counts. So Iskandar's claims of self-defense, they didn't hold up in court.
No, they did not. Justice Taeyong Kwang, who presided over the trial, he meticulously analyzed every single detail of this case and ultimately found Iskandar's version of events not credible.
What were the key factors that led to that guilty verdict? What convinced the judge that this was intentional murder?
So a couple of things really sealed Iskandar's fate here. First, the judge just didn't buy the idea that Tan Boon Sin, this older man known for his calm demeanor, would have initiated a violent attack. Especially given his knee condition, it just didn't add up.
Yeah, it's hard to picture, like we said, the victim as the aggressor in this scenario, especially considering his age and his physical limitations. What else swayed the judge?
The judge also found it highly suspicious that Iskandar could describe the alleged murder weapon with such detail. If he hadn't brought it with him, remember, that knife was never found. The judge concluded that Iskandar had plenty of opportunity to dispose of the weapon in the time that he was alone in the house before Tan Chiang arrived.
So that missing murder weapon, the one detail he was so specific about, really worked against him in the end.
It really did. The judge interpreted it as a sign of premeditation, not self-defense. And here's another crucial point the judge made. He highlighted that Iskandar had several opportunities to simply grab Tan Boon Sin's valuables and flee the scene without resorting to further violence.
So his actions really went far beyond, like you said, what would be considered reasonable self-defense, or even a robbery gone wrong.
Exactly. The level of violence, the missing weapon, his flight to Malaysia, all of it pointed to an intention to kill, contradicting his claim that he never meant for things to go so far.
It sounds like the judge really took his time, considered every angle, every detail before reaching this decision.
He absolutely did, and while he did ultimately find Iskandar guilty of both murders, he did acknowledge that the killing of Tan Chi Hyung was likely unplanned, a spur-of-the-moment act driven by panic. He actually referred to Tan Chi Hyung as collateral damage, tragically caught in the crossfire of Iskandar's desperate attempt to cover his tracks.
It's just heartbreaking, especially for his family, knowing that he was essentially in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, it is. It's a stark reminder of those ripple effects of violent crime, how it extends far beyond the immediate victims, leaving this trail of pain and loss in its wake.
So given the guilty verdict, what was the sentence?
Well, in Singapore, murder carries a mandatory death penalty. And so Iskandar was sentenced to death by hanging, a decision that was met with very mixed reactions, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I can only imagine the range of emotions, relief perhaps for the victims' families, but also just sadness and grief for everyone who was impacted by this tragedy. It's a chilling story, and one that I think raises so many questions about human nature, about the pressures that we face and the choices that we make when our backs are against the wall. Expert speaker, thank you so much for guiding us through this incredibly complex and tragic case.
Of course, it's a case that continues to resonate, I think. It reminds us that even places that are known for their safety and their order, darkness can still lurk beneath the surface, and sometimes the people that we least expect are capable of unthinkable acts.